Hello, everyone. Happy Thursdays. My name is Nat. Welcome to Exceptional Individuals. And today we're doing a deep dive into the fascinating world of psychosis, schizophrenia, bipolar, and antipsychotics. It is honestly, probably, definitely one of the most misunderstood mental health conditions that there is. And up until this point, we have avoided it like the plague, because the whole idea of neurodiversity in terms of the movement is about championing the strengths, the kind of positive approach to how brains think differently. Now, psychosis is definitely the brain thinking differently, but I think most people would agree that there are maybe more negatives than positives. You can completely contradict, you can say, nah, that's not true. I can just say, though, most people would consider it mental health, and most people would say it's definitely something they would rather not have. And today we're going to be learning about different support strategies, what it is, and also a bit of neuroscience. And this is where it might get a little bit complicated, but I've done my best to break it down as much as possible. Now, as I said, normally we specialize in dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, ADHD, something which I would argue is a disability due to how society treats us rather than an inherently a disability, where psychosis is a disability regardless of how society treats you, many would argue. Obviously, this is a contentious issue, and this isn't our exceptional individuals area of expertise. So please do call me out if you think, oh, I'm not so sure about that. Now, this is our lovely team. We're mostly neurodivergent, and we can support many different people. So do get in contact if you think maybe there's some way we can work together. Now, the last webinar we did was a nice, interesting one. It was about ADHD and medication. What is the medication? Do we need it? Why do some people not have it? Why is it expensive? How does it affect the brain? Check it out. It's on our YouTube now, and April has kindly edited it. Now, let's look at psychosis plus antipsychotics. Now, this is interesting, right? I'm really interested in antipsychotics, to be honest with you, because the name sounds quite daunting. Antipsychotics, it makes you feel like you've kind of lost the plot. Not at all. Typically, medication, when it is first created, it is created for the purpose it was originally used for. But then doctors and scientists will find out later in the day that actually it's more useful for other things. So, for instance, you might have depression and be antipsychotics, or OCD. You might not necessarily have psychotic episodes, but the medication might still be of use to you. So there's a lot of destigmatization that has to be done, not just on the diagnosis, but also on the medication that we use. Now, let's start off with a nice, difficult question. How would you explain psychosis? And honestly, I want you all to give it a go, even if you're not so sure, because it kind of really hits home the point that I think the majority of society has no idea what psychosis is. And this isn't about shaming anyone. It's just about thinking, what do we think we know? What do we know? And what probably could we learn more of?
I think people think of it, hi, Nat, it's Fazana.
Oh, yeah.
I think people think it's something, dysfunction with the brain.
Yeah, definitely, like something that isn't working correctly.
Yeah, that's people's perception of it. But people really don't want to go into it until it affects you as a carer, your loved one. Otherwise, people are not interested. They just want to keep away from it because it's the fear of the unknown.
Exactly, it is the fear of the unknown. And to be truthful with all of you guys, before I did my research in it, like ages ago, I'm a big horror lover. And when I associate psychosis with kind of insane asylums, and really kind of evil things and kind of witchcraft and possession. And this is how society has portrayed it. And this is why I think it's one of the most stigmatized one of the lot, because obviously that's not true. We're going to be learning about how prevalent or / common psychosis is in society. It's quite common, but people don't talk about it because of these connotations. what we've got a state of mind where reality is distorted and hallucinations become very real. Yeah, that's very true. To determine if something is real or not, can sometimes lose touch with reality, may experience auditory hallucinations, thought disorder, delusions, and paranoia. Yeah. Seeing things that aren't real. What is real? But yeah, people think it's about losing control. Very unusual perceptions of reality, ones that won't match with most other people's perceptions of reality. Nice. I mean, these are all correct, but obviously, like most things, it affects everyone differently. But if we were to look at the NHS definition of it, it's psychosis is a mental health problem that causes people to perceive or interpret things differently from those around them. This might involve hallucinations or delusions. So pretty much what all of you said, which is great. But if we break it down, you can learn a lot about something from understanding its language. Is a mental health problem. So here they're not saying it's a condition. You know, a condition I could say could be positive or negative. Here it is saying it is a problem. And this is why it typically isn't referred to as a neurodivergence, because most people would say it's a problem, full stop. That causes people to perceive or interpret. So it's not saying that you're definitely like seeing that fire-breathing dragon, but what you see, you believe real. And it's not actually, you know, when you actually ask yourself, how do we perceive reality? It makes sense that the brain could sometimes get confused, because what you're seeing right now isn't real. It's your brain's interpretations of the electrical signals that are hitting your retina and your eye. You know, the sound, the feeling, the texture, the warmth. All of this is a construct in our brain. So, and we often do things like when you take drugs, you are intentionally changing your chemistry in order to experience sensation. Now, sometimes the brain does that without you even wanting to. And this is what it can be like to have psychosis. It's imaginally, unintentionally taking drugs, having like a trip, but you don't want to be on this ride. And it can be quite scary for those around you. It can also involve hallucinations and delusions. So some people might experience like talking in their heads, people telling them to do things. They might see things that aren't there, like a mirage. It really is quite diverse and can affect people in many different ways. So on here, what are these symptoms of psychosis do you most associate psychosis with? I mean, they all are, but some are more heavily associated than others. So we've got hallucinations, which is when you see things that aren't there, delusions, when your kind of connection with reality is a bit disconnected, disordered thinking, just not thinking how you would normally think. Got to be careful not to say normal, though, because we all think differently, but normal is individual to you. We've got changes in mood or behavior. So are you acting differently to how you would normally act for you individually? And difficulty communicating, so struggling to get your point across. I mean, let's have a look. All of you answered them correct. Boop, 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 boop. Yep, all of these are typical symptoms, but please be mindful that you do not have to have all of these in order to have psychosis. This isn't like bingo. You know, you could have one or two things around. Some can affect you dramatically. Watching Emma's reactions always cracks me up. Now, approximately, and again, this estimate is a little bit, you know, dodgy because it's hard, not many people talk about it. It's about 1% of the population, like 1 in 100 people will typically have psychosis. And if we were to break that 1% apart, you'd have about 8% of that 1% have psychotic experiences. You know, we all do from time to time. Then 4% will have psychotic symptoms. These are things which are a bit more ongoing. And then only 3% of that 1% will have a disorder where it's significantly affecting them enough where they might seek a medical intervention for a diagnosis. All this is saying is that a lot of people who probably have psychosis do not have a diagnosis. And this is why the stats aren't that trustworthy. But either way, 1% might not sound a lot, but when you're talking about like how many people there are on the planet, it's a sizable proportion, and it's probably still way more than that anyway. All right, now there are lots of different types of psychosis. Remember, that's like an umbrella term. But out of these psychosis, which ones are you most familiar with? Have you heard of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression with psychiatric features, or substance-induced psychosis? Oh, no, interestingly. So like today, we're going to be mainly focusing on the, I guess I'd call them natural occurrences. Most people are used to it for substance abuse. So, teenagers who smoke too much weed, are far more likely to develop psychosis because their brains are still developing. And a lot of the time, we proactively encourage the delusion and attachment. It's something we want to experience. But that's because we have the control as to when we experience it. For people who do not have that control, it can be quite traumatic. So schizophrenia, most people have heard about. Bipolar, I think a lot of people have. And then depression with psychiatric features. So depression and psychosis are different, but you can get kind of like a hybrid version where you can feel really low and still have that detachment from reality. Oh, April says voted for bipolar because I have experience with it. I mean, definitely in my family, bipolar runs in the family. It's a challenging one. I think it's one of those things, if you can get it under control, you can live a perfectly lovely life. But getting it under control, getting that right balance of kind of well-being, medication, understanding is a journey. So I'm not undermining any of these. They can all be very, very challenging. And sometimes, prolonged substance abuse can actually result into some of these. So do not think that by taking drugs that it's a short-term thing. Sometimes they can last. And here are some like other ones that are available. Available. It sounds like you go to the shops. No, just they're not great. Typically, it develops when you're around 25-ish, 21 to 25. That's when you're most likely to notice or develop some of these. So what exactly causes psychosis? It's a tricky one. Multiple things can cause psychosis. Remember, unlike neurodivergence, where you're born with it, it's part of the development of you being born. Psychosis is something you develop. However, you can be more likely to develop it. So these are the things. Do you think biological factors like your DNA, who your parents are, maybe it's substance abuse? Is that going to be more likely to develop psychosis? What about childhood trauma, which can dysregulate the amount of neurotransmitters? These are the chemicals in your head. And if you get kind of too much of think of it like a tsunami of chemicals, it can really change your brain chemistry for your entire life. This is why when you're growing up, drugs are bad, okay? They're not good, especially when you're young. Everyone experiments, but just no prolonged use isn't going to do anyone any favors. And mental health, mental illness. So if you have other mental illnesses, are you more likely to develop psychosis? Okay, let's have a look. Trauma. I mean, just so you know, I don't know the answer to this one. It's a really hard thing to quantify. But all of these do have a part to play. So substance abuse, definitely, particularly in younger people, are more likely to develop it. Again, because your brain is busy kind of creating connections, and this is kind of altering them and weakening the connections, or just not allowing them to form properly. Trauma, trauma, we know so little about it. But we do know a lot of people who have psychosis have experienced trouble in their early years. Biological factors, unfortunately, it is hereditary, which means it runs in the family. So if you have it, there's a high likelihood that maybe someone in your family also does, like mum, dad, grandparents, though they probably didn't talk about it. And mental illness. There is a connection with co-occurrence. So if you have one thing, you are more likely to have something else. But I would probably say that's at the bottom as well. But yeah, great work, everyone. Now we're going to do a bit of brainy stuff, because this is where we're going to get a little bit sciencey. So please do stop me if you're completely lost, understandably. So this is the brain, right? Nice squishy bit of meat. And we've got different lobes. So we've got the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, parental lobe, frontal lobe. Essentially, you can cut the brain up into many different parts. And just worth knowing, because we're going to be talking about the brain. So we are a human being. Inside us is a brain. Inside that brain is a neuron, okay? A neuron is a really tiny cell in your brain. And this is essentially the communicator. Think of these like billions, and I'm not sure exactly how many, but millions and millions, maybe even billions of these in your brain connecting everywhere. So when you say, I want to move my arm, your finger going, vroom, 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 like kind of connecting. Think of this like the telephone wires are all over the earth, kind of connecting all our phone calls. And the way neurons work is through electricity, tiny little bits of electricity, and it's about talking to each other. So in the center, you got your little nucleus, and this is kind of like the brain of the brain. You got your dendrites. These are like the arms which kind of take the information. You've got the axon, which is the telephone line. And the myelin sheath, think of that like the plastic that is around your cables, not really doing much, but it is kind of protecting the cable and it allows the information to go faster. The Riviera, that is again the actual main part of the cable. And then the axon terminals, these are the bits that actually send the information, which is electricity/chemicals. I don't need you all to be experts in this, but it does help you understand what is happening with psychosis. To understand psychosis, we need to understand what's going on in the brain. So we talked about us, we've talked about the brain, we've talked about the neuron. Now let's get even deeper. Now we're going to focus on the little end here on the axon terminal. And at the end of those terminals are these little things. And essentially, they are pumping out chemicals. So our brain, think of this like our neurons don't actually touch each other. You think they're like holding hands to talk to each other. They're not. They're actually kind of, there's a gap in between. And for one to talk to the other, they have to like kind of squirt chemicals out almost. Like and the other one receives it. So at the end of the terminal, you'll see like, these are like the chemicals. Let's say dopamine, right? The dopamine is kind of here in little like sacs. And when the electrical signal gets rushed down the axon, that kind of long squiggly line, it pumps out a chemical and then it gets absorbed into the next neuron. So you see kind of how it's going. I'm hoping this is making rough sense. So our brain, it sends messages to each other, but the important thing to remember here is that the chemicals are all different and there is a gap. These are the chemicals. Now, you see these little triangles? These are what we call neurotransmitters. Essentially, that just means chemical. So this is a chemical molecule that sends a signal. Think of it just like the type of communication that you send across. If you want a bit of a pick-me-up, you might throw some dopamine. If you want to have better sleep, you might send some serotonin. Different chemicals will do different things. Now, I want you to let me know on what neurotransmitters have you heard of before? Now, I appreciate you may have never heard of the word neurotransmitters, but I guarantee you have heard of things like dopamine, maybe serotonin, acetylcholine. Apologies for my pronunciation. These are difficult words. Now, as you can see, dopamine might make you feel good. Oxytocin is like a love chemical. Serotonin, good for bodies. And ephedrins, they all do different things. Now, when we think of chemicals, we like things to be really damn simple. Like dopamine makes me feel good. It does more than that. All these things have multiple uses. And essentially, if you have too much of one thing, you're going to have a bad time. If you have too little of something, you're going to have a bad time. And our bodies are all over the place. So you want to make sure that there's enough regulation between the two. And you can probably start to see how psychosis starts to develop. It's because you have either too much or too little of one of these three. So now it's important. Now, can we just take a couple of supplements and sort it out? Well, that's kind of what we do with medication, but it's not as simple as we'd like to think, because again, this is a really, really simplified version on what we're talking about today. So we're going to get even deeper now, okay? We're like proper inception, inside. So within like these chemicals, right, the neurotransmitters and the start of the new neuron, you remember those dendrites, you have little receptors, and these are the kind of think of like a big baseball glove that kind of catches the chemicals, like, woohoo, I got the chemical, great. Now there's different kind of gloves which catch the chemicals. You've got ionotropic receptors and metabolic receptors. Apologies for the pronunciation. One essentially kind of allows it to go in, and one on the outside. It's not really that important for today, but why I'm mentioning it is that, for instance, some people have difficulties with the ion one, and other people have challenges with the metabolic one. And depending on which one is like the key issue, the one that's not kind of acting the way it should do, kind of indicates what type of psychosis you may have. And it might mean that different medication may work for one, but may not work for others. So if you ever wondered why medication doesn't always work, it's probably because we're treating it with the wrong thing. Another really good way of explaining why medication is a bit hit or miss is, I learned this from one of my lecturers, and imagine a car goes into a garage, right? And you can only do one thing to that car. The only thing you can do to that car is give it oil, because that is just the only tool you have available. Now, for some cars that need oil, ding, 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 you're going to have a good time. It's going to fix your car. But for all the cars that oil isn't a problem, it's not going to work. And this is kind of what the oil is, the analogy for the medication that we use. We don't know if it's going to work, but we know that it works for some people because that is what it's for. And we know it doesn't work for a lot of people. So, a lot of the time, doctors are really good at figuring out what isn't wrong with you and not so good at working out what is wrong. And this is why it can get a little bit complicated. So here's a quick test. I just want to make sure everyone's understanding and listening. What are neurons? Are they neurotransmitters? Are they chemicals? Are they cells? I mean, you could make arguments for some of them, but like most simplest one. Okay, let's see how you're doing. It is a cell. So a neuron is the parts in our brain, and within those like cells, we have neurotransmitters, and those neurotransmitters are chemicals. So yeah, it's kind of like the main part, the brain of the brain, I would say, or think of like the telephone cables in your head. Now, neurotransmitters, I'm going to be hitting this home until we all understand. Neurotransmitters, are they chemical molecules that carry signals, a sequence of changes in the voltage across a membrane, or cells that talk with other cells? Okay, nice, we're getting there, we are getting there. Okay, it is chemical molecules that carry signals. And why? Because again, the neurotransmitters are just the chemicals that are kind of like going across, kind of sending the messages. The cell that talks with other cells is a neuron, because that is the whole thing that does the whole talking. And a sequence of changes in the voltage across a membrane, that is the kind of electrical signal that is telling the neuron, hey, you should probably send those chemicals across now. Don't worry if you get these wrong, but I'm hoping that it will start to kind of all fit together like a nice puzzle. So I just want to get like a feel of the room. How are you currently finding this? Do you not understand it at all, which is fine? Do you not completely sure, but you kind of get it, or you're understanding it well? Okay, nice. I think most are understanding it well. A few of you, kind of. And honestly, this is really complex stuff. And if you have never been introduced to any neuroscience before, do not beat yourself up about it. But I wanted to rather give you more detail so you really understand what psychosis is. Otherwise, I'm just giving a very kind of top level understanding. Oh, Nicholas says, I wanted to study neuroscience at uni. You know what? It's never too late. It's a really fascinating subject. And what I love about it is we're still learning new things. Everything that we learn, you still get to question it. It's not like 100% fact. It's things which you can dive a little bit deeper. Now, we talked a bit about these receptors, right? I remember the receptors, think of them like a big baseball glove. The baseball glove that catches the ball, and the ball is the information. So these receptors, remember how I said there were different types of gloves? Well, the Metabotropic receptors, I can't pronounce anything, so I'm leaving this up to you. Metabotropic receptors, these are these ones. And in short, they are receptors, they are special proteins on the cells. They help send signals from outside the cell to inside. So the chemicals which are in that void, which we talked about, because remember those neurons aren't completely connecting, these are the things that kind of take them from the outside and pull them into the inside. These signals make changes inside the cells, so they're full of instructions. They work differently than other types, and there's a process called transduction to send signals. Again, not that important for today, but the main takeaway is that different receptors operate differently, hence why you would need different medication. But how do you know what receptor is the one we've got a problem with? Well, easier said than done. These things are really tiny. So a lot of the time, it might be guesswork until we find out, well, if one's not working, then I guess it might be the other one. Now let's have a look at one of these neurotransmitters. Remember these chemical signals. Dopamine, everyone loves a bit of dopamine. You know, this we use in kind of common language. But what do you think it predominantly affects? Do you think it is responsible for psychosis, depression, or memory? Now, please bear in mind, I'm simplifying a lot today. So you could make an argument for multiple different ways, but I'm going with like the most simple version. So dopamine is the feel-good chemical, has other purposes, but too much of it, too little of it can cause irregulation. It is psychosis. Now, again, it can affect depression, by the way, but there's another chemical which I would say has a bigger impact on whether depression or not. So if you have like too much dopamine, and dopamine is also a response. So, you know, we talked a bit about trauma. Well, let's say you're young and you experience trauma, your body doesn't know how to regulate that experience, and it might do a massive influx of dopamine. And that amount of dopamine can completely change how your body is wired for the rest of your life. If you're, you know, taking drugs for like a quick hit, again, your body just isn't prepared in order to handle it. I don't think this is a fair analogy, but I sometimes think of it like your, you know, liver, how, you know, when you're older, you're very much used to kind of sorting the alcohol and getting rid of that poison. But when you're younger, your body's not, and it can really mess you up. So dopamine, for today's sake, it's predominantly associated with psychosis. Now, what about that one?
Acetylcholine.
Acetylcholine, or whatever. Oh, this is what you get when you get like a dyslexic teaching you science. It's who knows what you're learning. So this is another neurotransmitter, and this is really important for muscle control, body function, and learning. Essentially, if you have a good balance of this, learning's going to be a lot easier. And the predominant one here is memory. So if you have the right regulation, memory is going to be a lot easier. And you'll notice that when you're depressed, your memory is not as good. If you have psychosis, if you're having a psychotic episode, your memory might also not be as good. So you can start to see how all these chemicals are very different, but they all play into each other. And last but not least, serotonin. So serotonin is a chemical which helps you sleep at night often. It can help with mood, sleep, digestion. This is just your genuine, like, good brain food that kind of keeps you ticking along. And yep, as you would have guessed, it's the one we've not mentioned. If you have an irregulation of serotonin, it can majorly affect depression. And you know, a good way of getting serotonin is going out in the sunshine. And this is why people say a nice bit of sun does make people feel better. And it's also why, you know, when you get those like sad lights, the like seasonal affective disorder, with those lights that are meant to replicate the sunlight and they make people feel better. Yeah, you got them? That is why they work, because they stimulate the brain into like making more serotonin, which hopefully balances out your lack of serotonin. So that's it in a nutshell. So a quick summary, just to make sure we're all on the same page. The brain has different structures. Makes sense. It does different things. The brain is made up of neurons, lots of neurons. Neurons release chemicals called neurotransmitters. Nice. Common neurotransmitters include dopamine, serotonin, and the other one that I really struggle to pronounce. Receptors transmit the actions of neurotransmitters, enabling cell-to-cell communication. So the receptors, these are the things which kind of catch the signals. Remember with those like big gloves? They kind of allow it to actually go into the next cell, from one neuron to the next neuron. Neurons can't communicate on their own. They need a little help. And psychosis can happen when this transmission is not working correctly. So why do we have psychosis? Well, it's when our brain just isn't connecting the dots, when the communication from one side of a neuron to the next side of the neuron isn't going smoothly. So terminology. What is the terminology? New words. Which of these words are you already familiar with? Have you heard of any of these before? Antipsychotics, antidepressants, or memory-sparing medication? Now, if you used any of these, you'll be very familiar, but not everyone is. Anti obviously means kind of getting rid of. Okay, now they're all correct, so I'm not going to bother doing that. Antipsychotics is hopefully getting rid of the negative parts of psychosis. Antidepressants is trying to get you out of that depressive hole. And memory-sparing medication is mostly related for people who have like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's. So just to make sure I actually said the right thing, antipsychotic medication is used to treat psychosis, usually schizophrenia, because again, different types of psychosis needs to be treated differently. Antidepressant medication is normally used to treat depression or prevent it, and very common. A lot of people who might take antidepressants aren't actually depressed. Important thing to know. Memory-sparing medication, Alzheimer's and dementia. Antagonists, these will definitely be some new words for you. A compound that binds to a receptor and causes a biological response, or an antagonist, a compound that binds to a receptor and blocks a biological response. So these two things we're going to go into a bit more detail because I'm guessing a lot of you would have never heard of these. That's completely fine. But you'll see here, think of it like Lego building blocks. We're talking about this big kind of like baseball glove. Imagine we do not want it to catch the ball. Like this signal that it's catching, we don't want you to catch it. So what we might do, we might put like I don't know, something else in the glove. And when the glove is holding something else, it's not able to hold on to anything else at the same time. So that is one way we might do to stop certain chemicals getting to the other side. Now, these two little funny characters, I mean, I'm guessing in reality they won't actually have little eyes, but they are cute nevertheless. The antagonist drug, when taking it, produces a chemical reaction after being attached to receptors. So you'll see here, like think of it like little Lego blocks. The little Lego block, it connects to the big baseball glove, and then it sends the signal. This is what normally happens, like, okay, you want a signal to be sent, it has to fit into the glove. And there's another type, which is more like a blocker. So this one, the antagonist is just to stop other things from going. One wakes it up, the other makes it go to sleep. And why this is important is that when it comes to psychosis, most are agonist. This is the most common one. So medication normally gets the brain to throw more chemicals. But for some people, we want to stop it because they have too much. So it really depends. Like, do you have too much dopamine in your body or not enough dopamine? If you have too much dopamine, you might want to have a blocker. If you have not enough dopamine, you might want to have a active receptor, which kind of helps throw some more down into the body. Yeah, April. Yeah, that is what often it is when it refers to TV being like a villain, but different kind of concept for this. So now we have a good idea about what exactly psychosis is, how it affects us, and what medication can do. I just want to make it really clear that medication is only but one way to support someone. So yes, medication is a standard one, but there's also psychotherapy where you talk with someone, work it out. Family and friends can also be a great supportive network, or self-care, looking after yourself. Healthy diet, food, exercise makes a world of difference. Do not think that medication is the only option. And a lot of the time, it's about working together.
Can I ask a question? What is the medication you mentioned? The second one was
The antagonist one.
That's the second one you just mentioned in that list of a sport. Or the physiotherapy. What is that?
Psychotherapy. That is just where, when you talk like a psychiatrist and you just kind of speak with them. Think of it like talking therapy.
All right, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. So these are all different ways that you can support, but I would probably argue that the best way is a combination of all of them. But obviously not a medical professional, speak to your doctor. We're going to be talking about drugs now. And we were talking about exactly what psychosis is, what's happening in the body, what's going wrong. Now we're going to be talking about how we might treat it with medication, while also appreciating medication isn't the only way. So these two things here, these are our axon terminals, remember our neutrons. And remember how I said there's a gap, right? Because they aren't connected. The way they send messages is by sending chemicals from one end to the other end. And let's say this is a nice bit of dopamine. Well, what we can do is a medication can block that dopamine from going from one end to the other end. So this is one type of medication. And how this happens is in a brain, think of the brain like loads of motorways. There's motorways going all over. You've got the A road, you've got the M road, you've got little like roads. Different roads allow for different amounts of connections. And we call these roads neuropathways. So where there's like the neurons all go in one direction, and not one direction, but you have like a big cluster of them. And it's a series of connected neurons that send signals from one part of the brain to another. You have a neuron that goes from your brain all the way to your feet. Some will go to the heart, but in the brain, you have lots of different ones. So when you have a big selection of these, we call it a pathway. So hopefully kind of keep that in your mind, neuropathway. And these pathways, they all have different names. Like you've got the M23, you got the M5. That's exactly what it is. It's just different names for different roads. And the Mesolimbic reward pathway. The reward pathway is the one that is typically related to dopamine, and this is like a positive one. So if you're not understanding this, just hold on tight, okay? Because I'm going to do my best to break it down even further, but this is probably the most complicated part of the day. So the Mesolimbic transports dopamine via vital pathways. So remember, dopamine is the feel-good chemical, and we also know it's primarily responsible for psychosis. So it goes up this thing and it travels around. And this is a result of positive symptoms. Now, do not get confused. Positive doesn't mean good. Positive just means it adds something. So the mesolimbic system is adding dopamine. It's not taking it away, it's adding it. And that's what we mean by positive. Positive in this context means adding rather than taking away. And if this pathway is working okay, we're going to have a good reward system. So every time we do something fun in life, we're going to get a little boost of dopamine and yep, we're having a good time. And salience, it's also going to help us evade threats, the flight or flight response. That time when you're like, oh, I need to get away from the situation, that means your body's working correctly. However, if you have too much of a good thing, because honestly, dopamine sounds amazing, well, if it makes me feel good, I need more of it. Well, if you have too much dopamine, you're going to have a bad time. You're going to get paranoia. And this is why a lot of people who take drugs, which again, they do it because they want to feel really good, they want to kind of have an extra boost of that dopamine, will eventually get paranoid. So just because something has a positive effect doesn't mean we want to have unlimited amounts of it. And antipsychotics now are clumsy. They suppress pleasure and threat evaluation. So remember the medication, how I told you it's not perfect. It's kind of like a bit hit or miss. The main idea is it is to slow down the dopamine. If your body is producing too much of this chemical, the drug will be like, nope, no more. You can't come here, which will help you with, say, the paranoia which is a good thing, but it's also going to stop you maybe from feeling pleasure. Some people who take this medication will get a bit depressed. Sometimes, the term zombies us out kind of makes us a bit mellow. It takes away who we are for some people. But the other thing which is quite useful to know is that for the medication to work, it needs to block at least 60 to 70% of dopamine. Why is this important? Well, a lot of people will stop taking medication, or they'll think, oh, I need a little bit today, or, I got a bit. If you aren't blocking at least 60%, it's not going to work. So it is very much a refined science, this, in terms of the threshold to whether or not medication works or doesn't work. So it's so important when it comes to psychosis that if you are taking medication, you take your medication, because even like one day off of it, it's just not going to work. It doesn't stay in the system that long. So the mesocortical pathway transports dopamine. And remember, dopamine is doing a similar thing. However, it is underactivated in schizophrenia. So the only difference with this pathway, similar to the last one, where the other one is sending too much, this isn't sending enough. This is just like, imagine you've got like a traffic jam on the M5. You are getting there, but really, really slowly. And this has negative symptoms. So remember, negative doesn't necessarily mean bad, though it kind of does in this point, but it just means you're getting something taken away from you rather than added. And it regulates the prefrontal cortex, and it, cognition, motivation, social expression. So if you ever see someone who seems really depressed, really down, lack of motivation, just not that bothered in engaging in society, potentially they might have a lack of dopamine. Too little dopamine, it equals schizophrenia. So hopefully this is making sense. Too much dopamine, paranoia. Too little, schizophrenia. So while they're all psychosis, depending on how the brain is taking or giving chemicals, will determine what type of psychosis you get. Fun, right? And now when it comes to the medication, antipsychotics again, they're all called antipsychotics, but they all work very, very different. So if you're like lost your medication and someone says, oh, I got some antipsychotics on me, don't take them, because for all you know, that antipsychotic might be adding more dopamine when actually you need something that blocks that dopamine. They do very, very different things. The antipsychotics are good for some symptoms, but they also have negative side effects. So with all medications, it's not a miracle drug. There's pros and cons, and it's often up to you and your doctor to work out, are the negative side effects worth it in order to counteract the symptoms which you are experiencing, which aren't positive? And this is a very personal choice. Now, a couple of other pathways, a couple of other motorways to mention, it wouldn't be fair to miss them, is the Neurodivergent one, regulates motivate limitations, degradation in Parkinson's. So people who have Parkinson's will often have a limitation of this one. Ah, God, why do I do this to myself? Please read it yourself. Part of the Okay, essentially, before I make a fool of myself, there are other pathways, and they also determine other elements of psychosis. So remember, we're mainly talking about paranoia, schizophrenia, bipolar today, but these are just some of the ways that psychosis presents itself, and how the others result are related to different pathways. So let's quietly move on before anyone realizes. Now, okay, so we've all talked about, we know what psychosis is. We also know how medication works, but we also know it's very different. So how do we diagnose it? Well, as I said, not a direct science, it's not that simple, but you might want to have a psychological assessment. This is when you're just talking to someone. This is very similar to how things like dyslexia and autism are diagnosed, just by speaking with someone, and people looking at a list of criteria and seeing what you align with and what you do not align with. Then we've got laboratory tests, so you can do actual tests, which again you cannot do for things like dyslexia and autism. And lastly, you can also have medical evaluations. So it's a combination of these three, which will normally allow you to know which one you have and what ones don't. Sometimes it can get tricky, people can get mixed up, and it's why it can take a while to find the right kind of support for you. Some ways we've already mentioned about how you can cope with psychosis is by having a strong support network, having people who get it, who have experienced it, taking the right medication for the right amount of time in the right doses. There's a lot of different factors, and do know if it's not working for you, talk to your doctor. Do not stop it. That's probably one of the worst things you can do. Healthy habits, just by eating well, the food we put in our body does contribute to the regulation of these neurotransmitters that we've been talking about. So there really are holistic, natural ways of supporting yourself and seeking help, looking for medical interventions. Oh, wow, this is a lot today and quite a confusing one. So in conclusion, psychosis is a serious mental health condition that can be difficult to understand with the right treatment and support. However, it is possible to manage the symptoms and live a fulfilling life. If you do have psychosis, you aren't damned, it is tough, but you can live very happily with it. You just have to make sure you get the right balance with everything. Oh, Nicola says, antipsychotic withdrawal can cause psychosis even in people who did not have psychosis when they were giving antipsychotics. Nicola, you're absolutely correct. And as I mentioned, antipsychotics aren't just for people with psychosis. You might use them for other reasons. But if you have that kind of fast withdrawal, then it could lead to psychosis. So you just got to be really mindful. So I really appreciate you mentioning that. Now, just to wrap up with, if any of you do have psychosis and are in the workplace, you can get support for it through a government grant. If you are in the workplace and you have psychosis or believe you do get in touch, because we might be able to make sure there's support, equipment, technology systems in place. It's not a miracle solution, but it's a good starting point. Now, the next webinar, if any of you are interested, this time next week, well, actually 1 hour at 12 next week, is Neurodivergent Brain. We are going to be looking at the human brain and looking at how do we, what is the brain? Nice and simple, but we're going to be going into quite some detail. And we record all our webinars. So if you want to catch up on this one, it will be uploaded hopefully within a week. And we also have other ones. You can like and subscribe, ring that little bell. You can also get in contact with us if you have any questions. Oh, that was a fun one to do. Honestly, a little bit out of my comfort zone from what we normally do, but really interesting. So thank you everyone for attending, and I hope that I get to see you next week as well. All right, bye.